Minasan konnichiwa, Miru desu. Okay, let's just jump right in. Back in the 19th century, European powers literally carved up the African continent in a mad dash for colonies. Well, fast forward to today, and a whole new competition is unfolding. The stage? It's Africa, all over again. But this time, the players and their rulebooks are completely different.
And this quote right here from the Institute for Peace Policies, it's not just some catchy phrase. No, it absolutely nails the new reality. What we're witnessing is a 21st century scramble, a really high-stakes game for influence, for resources, and for strategic advantage on one of the most dynamic continents in the world.
And here's exactly why the world is paying so much attention. Get this. By the year 2050, 1 out of every 4 people on this planet will be African. It's been called the last giant market for a very good reason. We're talking about a continent that is just bursting with demographic energy and, frankly, incredible economic potential. So that brings us to the big question, doesn't it? If this is a new scramble, who are the main players? Now, while Western nations are definitely still involved, 2 powers have just dramatically expanded their footprints, and they're using very, very different strategies. Those 2 are China and Russia. So let's break down their playbooks. All right, first up, China. And to really get their strategy, you've got to think long-term. I mean, think in decades, not just years. They have been playing the long game, focusing almost entirely on economic integration and building these deep, deep relationships all across the continent. This slide shows something that I find just fascinating. It speaks volumes about China's consistency. For 35 years in a row, without a single break, the very first foreign trip China's foreign minister takes every single year is to Africa. This isn't some new thing, it's a deeply ingrained diplomatic tradition that just goes to show how central Africa is to Beijing's vision. And that diplomatic dedication? It is backed up by some truly mind-boggling economic numbers. In 2023 alone, trade between China and Africa topped $282 billion. Just let that sink in for a second. That is a 26-fold increase since the year 2000. China isn't just a trading partner, it's Africa's largest trading partner, and it's not even close. And this chart, wow, it just lays out exactly where a lot of that money is going. Between 2007 and 2020, Chinese development banks loaned $23 billion for infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa. I mean, look at that. That is more than double what major institutions from the US, Germany, Japan, and France loaned combined during that same time. So, how is all this happening? Well, the engine driving all of the spending is China's huge global infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Through this program, China has funded and built over 100,000 kilometers of roads, more than 10,000 kilometers of railway, not to mention countless ports, power plants, and telecom networks. They are literally changing the physical landscape of the continent. But as you can imagine, this fire hose of money has kicked off a major debate. Is all this investment a genuine helping hand for African development, or does it come with some serious hidden costs? And this leads us right into the really controversial idea of debt trap diplomacy. Let's be fair and look at both sides of this. On one hand, a lot of African leaders love these Chinese loans because they get roads and ports built fast, without all the political strings about human rights or democracy that often come with Western money. But, on the other hand, the critics point to some big risks. The contracts can be really murky, a lot of the labor is Chinese, and there's this lingering fear that if a country can't pay its debt, China could just seize a strategic asset, like a port. It's a classic high-risk, high-reward situation. Okay, so that's China. Now let's switch gears completely and talk about Russia, because their strategy could not be more different. Russia doesn't have China's economic firepower, so Moscow has carved out a very specific, very different niche for itself, focusing almost entirely on security and military cooperation. So here's the Russian playbook in a nutshell. It is a straightforward transaction. They go to regimes, especially unstable ones that are kind of cut off from the West, and they offer military support, weapons, security guarantees. And in return, Russia gets political influence on the world stage and, maybe most importantly, access to incredibly valuable natural resources. This chart from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute really tells a huge part of the story. Between 2019 and 2023, who were the top 2 arms suppliers to sub-Saharan Africa? China and Russia.
Together, they account for more than a third of all major weapons flowing into the region, pushing aside traditional powers like France. And Russia's approach is pretty methodical. First, they target a country where maybe a military junta has just taken over. Then, they send in support through groups like the Africa Corps, which is basically the new Wagner group, to help that new regime hold on to power. In exchange, Russia gets an ally at the UN, and it secures these really lucrative mining deals for things like gold, diamonds, or uranium. And the absolute epicenter of this strategy has been the Sahel region in West Africa. We've seen a string of military coups there in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. That's created this domino effect. These new governments have kicked out French and US troops and have turned around and invited Russian security forces in. It's a move that has totally redrawn the security map of the entire region. So, we've got China's economic strategy and Russia's security strategy. But what does all this competition actually look like on the ground? What are the real-world consequences for the continent? Well, one of the most immediate things we're seeing is the near-total collapse of influence for former colonial powers, particularly France. This is fueled by real, local frustration, but it's also been amplified by targeted Russian disinformation campaigns. This powerful anti-French feeling has pushed French troops out of their long-held security roles, creating a power vacuum that, you guessed it, Russia has been more than happy to fill. But there's another much deeper consequence here, and it really gets to the heart of how these countries are governed. Both China's no-strings-attached money and Russia's direct military backing basically act as a lifeline for autocratic regimes. Suddenly, they don't need Western aid anymore, which means they're way less accountable to their own people or to any international pressure for democratic reforms. And in the most extreme cases, these big power rivalries can actually pour fuel on the fire of conflict. Take the absolutely devastating civil war in Sudan. It's become so much more complex now that Russia has gotten involved, trying to secure access to gold and a strategic port on the Red Sea. It's turning a local power struggle into a battlefield with clear signs of a proxy war. So all of this brings us to a really critical moment. You have these two powerful non-Western models being offered up to African nations, and the choices these nations make are going to have huge consequences for their future. So when you boil it all down, you see two very different playbooks, right? China's method is all about the economy, using massive infrastructure loans to unlock markets and resources. Russia's approach is all about security, using mercenaries and weapons deals to get political influence and, yep, just like China, access to resources. They're two totally different paths to the exact same goal: influence on a rising continent. One source we looked at put this whole geopolitical strategy in a really interesting way. It called it a policy of making friends with distant states while attacking those nearby. Think about it. Both China and Russia have a ton of tension with their direct neighbors, so they're essentially leapfrogging those local conflicts to build these deep relationships far away in Africa, creating a whole new block of global allies. But, and this is so important to remember, Africa is not just some passive chessboard for these big powers to play on. We are talking about a continent of 54 separate nations, each with its own leaders, its own interests, its own agency. They're actively choosing who to partner with, and they're making strategic decisions based on what they think is best for them. And that really leaves us with the ultimate question. As China comes in offering development and Russia comes in offering security, creating all sorts of new dependencies and opportunities, who is actually going to shape the continent's future? Is it going to be the external powers fighting for influence? Or is it going to be the African people and their leaders, who are the ones actually navigating this incredibly complex new world? このチャンネルが興味深いと思った方は、チャンネル登録といいねボタンをよろしく。